Quite literally just got out of the shower. Everybody got their hot cocoa and their PJs. Oh, I don't brush my hair when. Ooh, I just felt. Eh. Oh my goodness. Let's get these out of my way. Do I not have any sound? Where's my sound? Oh, come on. Every once in a while, my every once in a while, my sound will disappear on me. Every time let me see here. Every time I update my computer, even though it's Windows 10. Oh God, I don't want to troubleshoot anything. Just give me my friggin' sound. Give me my sound. You're seeing a bank page because there is no audio devices plugged into the system. Isn't that fun? Of course there's an audio device plugged into the system, which means after this, I'm going to have to, you know what, I'm going to just do it right now. Oh. Sorry, folks. See, that tells me it's plugged in. Oh, so I'm just gonna shut off my computer and start it again. It's updated and it's supposed to update and restart. You can hear me, but I can't hear my computer. You know what I mean? So I'm just going to shut this down and then I'm going to restart it. Doesn't stop us from having our time together. Okay? Yeah, shut down anyway. Hi, everybody. How's it going? Happy? Mike, I swear to God, my computer argues with me. It argues with me. Chapter 22, Happy Winter Days. It's my favorite time of day. Hey, Linda Bob. Hi, Willow's Garden, Barefoot Chickens. I have to wait for my keyboard to shut off, then I can turn my computer back on, and we'll be done by the time this is all over. So, happy winter days. The Christmassy feeling lasted day after day. Every morning, Mrs. Bose did her breakfast work quickly and came to spend time with the other girls. As she said, she was always merry and full of fun and always so pretty, with her soft dark hair and laughing blue eyes and the bright color in her cheeks. That first week, the sun shone brightly. There was no wind, and in 6 days the snow was all gone. The prairie showed bare and brown, and the air seemed warm as milk. Mrs. Bose had cooked the New Year's dinner. Yeah, really, eh? But remember, if it wasn't for computer, we wouldn't be together, would we? We wouldn't even know each other. Mrs. Bose had cooked the New Year dinner. You can all crowd into my little place for once, she said. She let Laura help her move things. They put the table on the bed and opened the door wide against the wall. Then they set the table in the exact middle of the house. One corner almost touched the stove, and the other end was almost against the bed. But there was room for them all to come in single file and sit around it. Sounds like our kitchen when I was growing up. Mrs. Bose sat by the stove and served the food from its top. First there was oyster soup. In all her life, Laura had never tasted anything so good as that savory, fragrant, sea-tasting hot milk, with golden dots of melted cream and black specks of pepper on its top, and the little canned oysters at its bottom. She sipped slowly and slowly from her spoon to keep the taste going over her tongue as long as she could. And with this soup, there were little round oyster crackers. The little oyster crackers were like doll crackers, and they tasted better because they were so light and small. When the last drop of soup was gone and the last crackers divided and crunched, there were hot biscuits with honey and dried raspberry sauce. And then a big dishpan full of tender, salty popcorn that had been keeping hot on the back of the stove. That was the New Year's dinner. It was light but filling. There was something fashionable about it because it was so old and new, because it was so odd and new, so different and so dainty served on Mrs. Bow's pretty dishes and brand new tablecloth. After that, yeah, because she came as a bride, didn't she? He went home to marry her and bring her back. Hi, Karina. Hey, Willow. Howie's back is improving, but I still envy his mobility. Afterward, they sat talking in the little house with the soft air coming in and beyond the open door. The brown prairie stretching far away and the soft blue sky curving down to meet it. I've never tasted finer honey, Mrs. Boast, said Pa. I'm glad you brought it with you from Iowa. The oysters, too, said Ma. I don't know when I've had such a treat as this dinner. It's a good beginning for 1880, Pa declared. The 70s haven't been so bad, but it looks like the 80s will be better. If this is a sample of a Dakota winter, we're all lucky we came west. This is certainly a fine country, Mr. Boast agreed. I'm glad I've got my claim filed on 160 acres of it, and I wish you had, Ingalls. I'll have it before I'm a week older, said Pa. I've been waiting for the land office to open in Brookings to save me more than a week's travel to Yankton and back. They said the Brookings office would open the first of the year, and by Jove, with weather like this, I'm starting tomorrow if Carolyn says so. I do, Charles, Ma said quietly. Her eyes, her whole face were shining with gladness because now, so soon, Pa would surely have their homestead. That settles it, said Pa. Not that I figure there's any danger of being late, but I might as well be done and over with. The sooner the better, Ingalls, Boast said. I tell you, you've got no notion what the rush is going to be this spring. Well, nobody will be here quicker than I'll be, Pa answered. He always, his attitude towards everything is like, oh well, we can do it, we can do this, we can do that. Instead of, when the last person was out and they moved into that house, he should have went to Yankton. The sooner the better, Ingalls. I tell you, you've got no notion what the rush is going to be this spring. Well, nobody will be here quicker than I'll be, Pa answered. Well, if technically Mr. Boast was there quicker than him, why? Because Mr. Boast went out, filed on his claim, married his girl, and came back. His claim is secure. Starting before sunup, I ought to show up at the land office bright and early day after tomorrow morning. So if you folks want to send any letters back to Iowa, get them fixed up and I'll take them along and mail them in Brookings. That ended New Year's dinner. Mrs. Boast and Ma were writing letters that afternoon, and Ma packed a lunch for Pa to take with him. But at nightfall, a wind full of snow was blowing and frost began to creep up the window panes again. This is no kind of weather to go anywhere, said Pa. Don't worry about the homestead, Caroline. I'll get it. Yes, Charles, I know you will, Ma replied. Excuse me. In the stormy weather, Pa tended his trap lines, stretched the skins to dry. Mr. Boast hauled brushwood from Lake Henry and chopped it up to burn, for he had no coal. And every day Mrs. Boast came. Often when the sun was shining, she and Laura and Carrie, well wrapped up, played in the deep snow together. They wrestled and ran and threw snowballs. And one day they made a snowman. And hand in hand in the sharp, bright cold, the three of them ran and slid on the ice of Silver Lake. Laura never laughed so much. Just tells you how old Mrs. Boast was. She was probably 17. Late one afternoon, when they had been sliding and were coming home warm and breathless, Mrs. Bose said, "Laura, come over to my house a minute." Laura went with her, and Mrs. Bose showed her a tall stack of newspapers. She brought all those New York ledgers from Iowa. "Take as many as you can carry," she said. "When you read them, bring them back and get some more." Laura ran all the way home with an armful of papers. She burst into the house and dropped them in Mary's lap. "See, Mary, see what I've brought. Stories, they're all stories." Now newspapers full of politics, if you can even find a newspaper. "Oh, hurry up and get the supper work done so we can read," Mary said eagerly. But Ma said, "Never mind the work, Laura. Read us a story." So while Ma and Carrie got supper, Laura began to read them all a wonderful story about dwarves in caves where robbers lived and a beautiful lady who was lost in the caves. And at the most exciting part, she came suddenly to the words, "To be continued." And there was not another word of that story. "Oh, dear me. We never will know what became of the lady," Mary lamented. "Laura, why do you suppose they print only part of a story?" "Why do they, Ma?" asked Laura. "They don't," said Ma. "Look at the next paper." So Laura looked at the next and the next. "Oh, here it is. And more," she cried. "It goes right on down through the pile. It's all here, Mary. Here it says the end." "It's a continued story," said Ma. Laura and Mary had never before heard a continued story, but Ma had. "Well," Mary said contentedly, "now we can save the next part for tomorrow. Every day we can read one part, and that will make the stories last longer." "That's my wise girl," said Ma. So Laura did not say that she would rather read as fast as she could. She laid the papers carefully away. Every day she read one more part of the story, and then they wondered until the next day what would happen to the beautiful lady. On stormy days, Mrs. Bose brought her sewing or knitting, and those were cozy days of reading and talking. One day, Mrs. Bose told them about whatnots. She said that everyone in Iowa was making whatnots, and she would show them how. So she told Pa how to make the shelves, 3-cornered to fit in a corner. He made 5 shelves of graduated sizes, the largest at the bottom and the smallest at the top, all fastened solidly with narrow strips of board between them. When he had finished, the whatnot fitted snugly into a corner of the room and stood firmly on 3 legs. At its top shelf was as high as Ma could easily reach. Then Mrs. Bose cut a curtain of pasteboard to hang from the edge of each shelf. She scalloped the bottom of the pasteboard, a large scallop in the middle, and a smaller scallop on each side. The pieces of pasteboard and the scallops were graduated like the shelves, from large at the bottom to small at the top. Next, Mrs. Bose showed them how to cut and fold small squares of heavy wrapping paper. They folded each square corner-wise and then across and pressed it smooth. When dozens of the squares were folded, Mrs. Bose showed Laura how to sew them in rows on the pasteboard, close together with the points down. Each row overlapped the row below it, and each point must lie between 2 points of the row below it, and the rows must follow the scallop curves. While they worked in the snug, cozy house, they told stories and sang and talked. Ma and Mrs. Bose talked mostly about the homesteads. Mrs. Bose had seeds enough for 2 gardens. She said she would divide with Ma, so Ma never need not worry about seeds. When the town was built, there might be seeds in town to sell, but then again, there may not. So Mrs. Bose had brought plenty from the gardens of her friends in Iowa. "I'll be thankful when we're settled," said Ma. "This is the last move we're going to make. Mr. Ingalls agreed to that before we left Minnesota. My girls are going to have schooling and lead a civilized life." Laura did not know whether or not she wanted to be settled down. When she had schooling, she would have to teach school, and she would rather think of something else. She would rather sing and think than think at all. She could hum very softly without interrupting the talk. and then often Ma and Mrs. Boast and Mary and Carrie would sing with her. Mrs. Boast had taught them 2 new songs. Laura liked the Gypsy's Warning. Do not trust him, gentle lady, though his voice be low and sweet. Heed not him who kneels before you, gently pleading at your feet. Now thy life is in the morning. Cloud not this thy happy lot. Listen to the gypsy's warning, gentle lady. Heed him not. The other song was when I was 1 and 20, Nell, and you were 17. It was Mr. Boast's favorite song. He had been 21 when he met Mrs. Boast, and she had been 17. Her name was really Ella, but Mr. Boast called her Nell. At last, the 5 pasteboard pieces were neatly covered with rows above rows of the little paper points, and no stitches showed except along the top row. Then Mrs. Boast sewed a strip of the wide brown paper above these stitches and folded it over to hide them. Finally, they tacked each pasteboard curtain to itself. The stiff scallops covered with the stiff little paper points hung down stiffly. Then Pa carefully painted the whole whatnot, all the little paper points a rich dark brown, and all the paper little points a rich dark brown. When the paint dried, they set the whatnot in the corner and behind Mary's chair. So that's a whatnot, said Pa. Yes, said Ma. Isn't it pretty? It's a neat job, said Pa. Mrs. Boast says they're all the rage in Iowa, she told him. Well, she ought to know, Pa agreed. And there's nothing in Iowa too good for you, Caroline. But the best time of all was after supper. Every evening, Pa played the fiddle, and now Mr. Boast and Mrs. Boast, cheerful voices, beautiful voices, rounded out the singing. Gaily Pa played and sang. When I was young and single, I could make the money jingle, and the world went well with me, oh then, the world went well with me then. I married me a wife, oh then, I married me a wife, oh then. I married me a wife, she was the joy of my life, and the world went well with me then. The song went on to say that she was not such a good wife after all, so Pa never sang the rest of it. His eyes twinkled at Ma while the music laughed and whirled, and then he would sing, She can make a cherry pie, Billy boy, Billy boy. Can she make a cherry pie, charming Billy? She can make a cherry pie with a twinkle in her eye, but she was a young thing and cannot leave her mother. The music would go rollicking while only Pa and Mr. Boast sang. I bet my money on the bobtail mare, and you bet your... That was my Aunt Josie's song. Camptown races, sing this song, doo-dah. Even in songs, Ma did not approve of gambling, but her toe could not stop tapping while Pa played such tunes. Then every evening they all sang one round. Mr. Boast's tenor would begin Three Blind Mice and go on while Mrs. Boast's alto began Three Blind Mice. Then as she went on, Pa's bass would join in Three Blind Mice, and then Laura's soprano, Mary's contralto, Mary and Carrie. Ma's contralto and Mary and Carrie. When Mr. Boast reached the end of the song, he began it again without stopping, and they all followed each other, behind each other, going round and round with words and music. Three blind mice, see how they run, see how they run. They all ran after the farmer's wife who cut off the nails with a carving knife. You never saw such a sight in your life. It's three blind mice. Did I get the words right? Yep, I did. They went on singing until someone laughed, and then the song ended ragged and breathless and laughing. And Pa would play some of the old songs to go to sleep on, he said. Nellie was a lady, last night she died. Oh, toll the bell for lovely Nell, my old Virginia bride. And, oh, do you remember sweet Alice, Ben Bolt, sweet Alice with eyes so brown, who wept with delight when you gave her a smile and trembled with fear at your frown? And oft in the stilly night, ere slumber's chain was bound me, sweet memory brings the light of other days around me. Laura had never been so happy. For some reason, she was the happiest of all when they were singing. I know that feeling. Ye banks and braes of bonny Doon, how can ye bloom, say fresh and fair? How can ye chaunt, ye little birds, and I say weary, full of care. I've only seen a couple of times, but my grandmother would always made us come in early evening before she traipsed around. What are we talking about? My computer's still not back on. My grandmother on my dad's side would pin newspapers over the windows at night because the next door neighbor, Mr. Newbert, would dress in women's clothes. Oh, good for him. I'm missing an interesting I only seen him a couple of times, but my grandmother would always made us come in early evening before he traipsed around. Well, he'd fit right in now, wouldn't he? All right. My computer still has not restarted, so I'm going to continue on with the Pilgrim's Way, on the Pilgrim Way. Chapter 23. One Sunday evening, Pa's fiddle was singing a Sunday tune, and they were all singing heartily with it. When cheerful we meet in our pleasant home, and the song of joy is swelling, do we pause to think of the tears that flow in sorrow's lonely dwelling? Let us lend a hand. Suddenly the fiddle stopped. Outdoors a strong voice was singing, to those who are faint and weary, let us lend a hand to those on the Pilgrim's Way. The fiddle squawked in amazement as Pa dropped it on the table and hurried to the door. The cold burst and the door slammed behind him. Outside it, there was an outburst of voices and the door flung open and two snowy men stumbled in while Pa said behind them, I'll see to putting up your team. Be with you right away. One of them was a tall and thin man. Between his cap and muffler, Laura saw blue, kind eyes. Before she knew what she was doing, she heard herself screaming, Reverend Alden! Reverend Alden! Not Brother Alden, Ma exclaimed. Why, Brother Alden! He had taken off his cap now, and they could all see his pleasant eyes and his dark brown hair. We're all pleased to see you, Brother Alden, Ma said. Come to the fire. This is a surprise. You are no more surprised than I am, Sister Ingalls, said Reverend Alden. I left you folks settled on Plum Creek. I had no idea you were way out west, and here are my little country girls grown into women. Laura could not say a word. Her throat was choked with joy of seeing Reverend Alden again. But Mary said politely, We're glad to see you again, sir. Mary's face was shining with gladness. Only her sightless eyes were blank. They startled Reverend Alden. He looked quickly at Ma and then at Mary again. I was little, and believe me, that confused a child. No kidding. You can imagine what the kids are going through today? The kids are telling the adults how they need to live. I can't go on. Hi, Mr. and Mrs. Boast. Here, Mr. and Mrs. Boast are neighbors. Reverend Alden, said Ma. Reverend Alden said, You were all doing some fine singing when we drove up. And Mr. Boast said, You did some fine singing yourself, sir. Oh, I wasn't the one who joined in, said Reverend Alden. That was Scotty here. I was too cold, but his red hair keeps him warm. Reverend Stewart, these are old good friends of mine, and they're friends, so we're all friends together. Reverend Stewart was so young that he was not much more than a big boy. His hair was flaming red, his face was red with cold, and his eyes were sparkling cold gray. Set the table, Laura, Ma said quietly, tying on her apron. Mrs. Boast put on an apron too, and they were all busy poking up the fire and setting the kettle to boil for tea, making biscuits, frying potatoes, while Mr. Boast talked to the visitors who stood in the way, thawing themselves by the stove. Pa came in from the stable with two more men who owned the team. They were homesteaders going out to settle on the Jim River. Oh, I would have said because they're confused and they don't know what they want to be. So you just let them be who they want to be and never mind and mind your own business. That's what I would have said. Laura heard Reverend Alden say, We too are just passengers. We hear there's a settlement on the Jim, a town named Huron. The Home Missionary Society sent us out to look over the ground and make it ready make ready to start a church there. I guess there's a town site marked out on the railroad grade, said Pa, but I never heard of any building there except a saloon. All the more reason we should get a church started, Reverend Alden answered cheerfully. After the travelers had eaten supper, he came to the door of the pantry where Ma and Laura were washing the dishes. He thanked Ma for the good supper, and then he said, I'm sorry indeed, Sister Ingalls, to see the affliction that has come to Mary. Yes, Brother Alden, Ma answered sadly. Sometimes it's hard to be resigned to God's will. We all had scarlet fever on our place on Plum Creek, and for a while it was hard to get along. But I'm thankful that all the children were spared to us. Mary is a great comfort to me, Brother Alden. She has never once repined. Mary is a rare soul and a lesson to all of us, said Reverend Alden. We must remember that to whom the Lord loveth, he chasteneth, and a brave spirit will turn all our afflictions to good. I don't know whether you and Brother Ingalls know that there are colleges for the blind. There's one in Iowa. Well, that makes sense. Ma took tight hold of the edge of the dishpan. Her face startled Laura. Her voice sounded choked and hungry. She asked, how much does it cost? Now, back in those days, those schools didn't cost anything, except for your transportation, your board, all that stuff. I don't know, Sister Ingalls, Reverend Alden answered. I will make inquiries for you if you like. Ma swallowed and went on washing dishes. She said, we can't afford it, but perhaps later, if it doesn't cost too much, we might somehow manage sometime. I always wanted Mary to have an education. Laura's heart beat hard and thick. She could feel its beating in her throat, and wild thoughts fluttered so fast in her mind that she did not know what any of them were. We must trust in the Lord to do all things for our good, said Reverend Alden. Shall we have a short prayer meeting, all of us together, when you finish the dishes? Yes, Brother Alden, I should like that, said Ma. I'm sure we all would. When the dishes were done and their hands washed, Ma and Laura took off their aprons and smoothed their hair. Reverend Alden and Mary were talking together earnestly while Mrs. Boast held Grace, and Mr. Boast and the two homesteaders were talking to Reverend Stewart and Pa about the wheat and the oats he intended to raise as soon as he could get his sod broken. When Ma came in, Reverend Alden stood up, and they said they would all have the refreshment of prayer. I always call it spiritual nourishment. Prayer together before saying good night. They all knelt down by their chairs, and Reverend Alden asked God, who knew their hearts and their secret thoughts, to look down on them where they were on them there, and to forgive their sins and help them to do right. A quietness was in the room while he spoke. Laura felt as if she were hot, dry, dusty grass parching in a drought, and the quietness was cool and gentle and rain falling on her. It truly was a refreshment. Everything was simple now, that she felt so cool and strong, she would be glad to work hard and go without anything she wanted for herself so that Mary could go to college. Then Mr. and Mrs. Boast thanked Brother Alden and went home, and Laura and Carrie brought Carrie's bed downstairs. Ma made it down on the floor by the stove. We've only the one bed, Ma apologized, and I'm afraid there are no covers enough for it. Don't worry, Sister Ingalls, said Reverend Alden. We'll use our overcoats. We'll be very comfortable, I'm sure, said Reverend Stewart. And glad we are to have found you folks here. We thought we had to go all the way to Huron until we saw your light and heard you singing. Upstairs, Laura helped Carrie unbutton in the dark. She tucked the hot flat iron close against Mary's feet in the bed, and as they all snuggled tight together to get warm under the icy cold covers, they heard Pa and the travelers still talking and laughing around the fire. Laura, Mary whispered, Reverend Alden told me there are colleges for the blind. He should not have told her that until the parents were sure that they could get her there. What, for blind people? Carrie whispered. Colleges, whispered Laura. Where they get college educations. How can they? Asked Carrie. I thought you had to read to study. I don't know, Mary said. Anyway, I couldn't go. It must cost something. I don't suppose there's any chance I could. Ma knows, Laura whispered. Reverend Alden told her, too. Maybe you can, Mary. I do hope you can. She took a deep breath and promised, I will study hard so I can teach school and help. In the morning, the travelers' voices and a clatter of dishes woke her, and she sprang out of bed to dress and hurry downstairs to help Ma. Outdoors was crisp and cold. Sunshine gilded the frosty windows, and in the house everyone was hearty and cheerful. How the travelers did enjoy that breakfast. They praised everything they ate. The biscuits were light and flaky. The fried potatoes were brown and finely hashed. The slices of fat pork were thin and crisp, and the gravy was smooth and brown and creamy. There was hot brown sugar syrup, and plenty of fragrant steaming tea. This meat is delicious, Reverend Stewart said. I know it's just fat salt pork, but I never tasted any like it. Would you tell me how to cook it, Sister Ingalls? Ma was surprised, and Reverend Alden explained, Scotty's going to stay out there in the missionary field. I've only come out to get him started. He'll be batching it and doing his own cooking. Do you know how to cook, Brother Stewart? Ma asked, and he said he expected to learn by experience. He had brought supplies, bean flour, salt tea, and salt pork. Well, the meat's easy, said Ma. You cut the slices thin and set them to parboil in cold water. When the water boils, you pour it off. Then roll the slices in flour and fry them brown. When they are crisp, take them out onto a platter and pour some of the fat off. Save it to use for butter. We call that country butter. Then brown some flour in the fat left in the frying pan and pour in some milk and keep stirring as it boils until the gravy is just right. Would you mind writing it down, Reverend Stewart? Asked Reverend Stewart. How much flour and how much milk? Goodness, said Ma. I never measure. But I guess I can make a stab at it. She got a sheet of paper and her little pearl-handled pen and the ink bottle and wrote down the recipes for fried salt pork and gravy, and for sourdough biscuits and bean soup and baked beans, while Laura cleared the table quickly and Carrie ran to ask Mr. and Mrs. Boast to come over for a preaching service. It seemed odd to have church on Monday morning, but the travelers were starting on the last stage of their journey to Huron, and no one wanted to lose this opportunity to hear a sermon. Pa played the fiddle, and they all sang a hymn. Reverend Stewart, with Ma's back then they called them receipts, with Ma's receipts in his pocket, made a short prayer for guidance in all their worthy endeavors. Then Reverend Alden preached the sermon. After that, Pa's fiddle gaily and sweetly played, and they all sang, There is a happy land far, far away, where the saints in glory stand bright, bright as day. Oh, to hear the angels sing glory to the Lord our King. When the team and wagon, sorry folks, I'm a little sweaty here. It's been a busy day. Sorry. Horses sweat, men perspire, and women glisten. So I was glistening pretty heavy. When the team and wagon were ready to start, Reverend Alden said, You have had the first church service in this new town. In the spring, I will be back to organize a church. And he said to Mary, Laura, and Carrie, We will have a Sunday school, too. You can all help with a Christmas tree next Christmas. He climbed into the wagon and went away, leaving them with that to think about and look forward to. Wrapped in shawls and coats and mufflers, they stood watching the wagon going westward on the untouched snow and leaving the marks of its wheels behind. The cold sun shone brightly, and the white world glittered millions of tiny sharp points of light. Well, Mrs. Boast said through a fold of shawl drawn across her mouth, It's nice to have had the first church service here. What is the name of the town that's going to be here? Carrie asked. It doesn't have a name yet, does it, Pa? Said Laura. Yes, Pa answered. It's De Smet. It's named for a French priest who came pioneering out here in the early days. They went into the warm house. That poor boy'll ruin his health, most likely, said Ma, batching all by himself and trying to live on his own cooking. She meant Reverend Stewart. He's Scotch, said Pa. Now, excuse me. Scotch is a drink. Scots, Scots, is how you actually say, like a person is Scots. You don't say Scotch. Scotch is a drink. He's Scotch, said Pa. As if that meant he would be all right. What did I tell you, Ingalls, about the spring rush? Said Mr. Boast. 2 homesteaders in here already, and March hardly begun. That struck me too, said Pa. I'm making tracks for Brookings tomorrow, rain or shine. The other day, I was making, we had our steaks left over from the track, so I was making steak sandwiches. Like, slice it thin, mustard, roast beef, toast, butter, that kind of thing. And I said to Howie, I said to Howie, I called him in the coach, and I said, bring me in the butter, the tub of butter I took out when we went to the thing, because the only butter I had was in the fridge and cold. So he puttered around and he friggin' puttered around, and he came in for supper, forgot the butter. So you know what I did? Whenever I make bacon, which isn't often, I strain the grease through a strainer into a jar, and it looks like lard, but it tastes like bacon. So what I did is I toasted our sandwiches and I buttered them with bacon drippings, and then put the beef in that. And he never said a word. Never said a word. Save them bacon drippings. I gotta let you guys go. I still have a video to edit for tomorrow on our half-acre homestead before I go to bed. So I hope everyone had an enjoyable evening. And don't forget, folks, I'll probably be reading again tomorrow night. And folks, for Patreon, Friday is Freaky Friday. Yeah, me too. It'll be fun. It'll be fun reading tomorrow night. All right. Listen, I love you guys. Take care. God bless. I have a bit of work to do before I sleep. All right? Mwah! I love you guys.